workshop given by Chen. Austin is one of the co-founders of Manifold Markets, a play money prediction market platform where you can bet on anything. And Mo and I have been testing out Austin's prediction skills on our walk to this room. So you've got a real treat in store for you. In this workshop, Austin's going to talk about the principles of forecasting and how forecasting might be important to the EA community, and walk through some exercises to help attendees hone their forecasting skills. The session will involve hands-on demonstration on how to use the prediction market setup at Manifold Markets. We'll be taking Q&A at the end with the roving mics. Please give Austin a very warm welcome.
Hello, hello. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to see everyone here, excited to learn about forecasting. I'm going to start us off by directing you all to Manifold Markets, the website. So take out your phones right now, and you can scan this QR code, which will take you to Manifold. In the meantime, I'll talk a bit about what Manifold is. It's a place where you can create prediction markets for free. You can go ask any question that you like, and then people will come and bet on the outcome of that question using our currency, Manifold Dollars. It's our video game currency. But the catch is you can actually donate the Manifold Dollars, to the charity of your choice if you win. So it looks like lots of people are scanning it. It'll probably take you a minute or so to get signed up. You just need a Google account to log in. But we'll be using this to run all the exercises today. So as I'm giving you all more time to sign up, my background is actually not as a forecaster. I'm more of a software engineer / entrepreneur kind of person. So really, I'm not going to be giving you a lot of advice about how to forecast per se, but how to use the tools to forecast on your own. So the intent of this workshop is kind of by the end, you all will really know how to do forecasting on your own and how to ask good questions, how to create markets, all of that. That's what we're going to be running through today. All right. For those of you all trickling in, go ahead and scan that QR code. This will take you to Manifold, and you can sign up and get an extra 500 Manifold dollars. Or you can just go to manifold.markets to find the site. Then you won't get the bonus. All right. Cool. And before we jump into predicting on Manifold, I'll just go through a few high-level overview of what exactly is forecasting. I see. Cool. Intro to forecasting. So I kind of think of forecasting as having 4 main components. This is just my own personal breakdown. It's pretty intuitive, honestly. First off, when you're forecasting, you're basically asking a question about the future. Most of the time, it's kind of a yes/no question. I put up 4 examples of questions that can be found on Manifold. And one thing you might want to do as I'm going over this is think about what your own probability for these questions are. Yes/no questions are often of the form will this thing happen? You can see will Putin be the leader of Russia during all of 2022? Or will the Petrov Day exercise end successfully? So these are pretty simple things to forecast on. And the goal is to kind of elicit a probability, try to see what chance, how likely is this thing to occur. Other kinds of things that are good to forecast on are numeric quantities, maybe how many people are going to come to this workshop, or how many cases of monkeypox will be diagnosed in 2022. You notice these are all numeric because it allows you to score the questions, score how well you've been doing, which is an important component of forecasting. So after you have a question about the future, here are the answers, by the way, or at least the answers according to Manifold Markets. The next step is kind of figure out what your own prediction is for this particular question. There's a few different ways to do this. One of the most common ones is to do what's called reference class forecasting, which is to say you think about what are some examples of this same kind of event, how likely have they happened before, and use that to inform your current decision. So one example maybe for Lestrong's Petrov Day. So this is kind of an exercise that is hosted on Lestrong. And people can click on a button and shut down the site. And the goal is to kind of coordinate around not clicking on this button. I think Lestrong has run this thing twice before. And one time, nobody shut down the site, and one time they did shut down the site. So you might say, in the reference class of the Lestrong Petrov Day exercise, there's 2 instances, one of which succeeded, one of which failed. So there's a 50% chance, maybe a baseline, that this thing will fail. And then you can see, oh, but it's 94%. I wonder why. You can kind of dive into more about what specifically is different about this exercise that makes people really think that this one will fail. When I was talking about before, there being like two instances that like you draw one of them, that's kind of like the outside view look, where you're just kind of thinking about, oh, starting from like an outsider's perspective, how likely is this thing to happen? The inside view is when you kind of go in and add information that you kind of like personally have. For example, maybe you've done some research about this particular exercise, and you know that this time they're letting anybody click on the button, as opposed to just like people with high amounts of karma. And that kind of makes it such that you think it's a lot more likely to fail, thus the much higher probability trading on the market. There's a few other things that you can do when you're trying to think about like how to actually forecast. You can like build a model, which is actually a fancy way of just saying like multiply some numbers together, or do like a back of the envelope calculation, another fancy way of saying like multiply some numbers together. An example is like, for example, I was trying to figure out how to forecast the number of people to come to this workshop. I knew there were like 140 people who had signed up on SwapCard. And somebody told me that like maybe like 80% of the people show up. So a simple model there is to multiply 140 by like 80% attendance to get, I don't know, something like about 100 people might attend this particular workshop. So those are like simple ways to forecast. I don't know if I was right. This looks like closer to like 60 to 70 people maybe. So maybe a little bit overconfident then, or like overestimating on the number of people who show up. All right, and finally, actually I'll talk about calibration in a little bit. OK, the next step about forecasting that I think is really important is actually just like writing down your predictions. And this one people like kind of like forget about oftentimes, but it's really important to like put down the thing that you forecast, because this actually lets you like kind of check how good you are. And it's really easy to like say a forecast and kind of like later think like, you know, I was probably right all along. But writing it down in some form, either by like just like logging your forecast in like Word form, or using a system like Manifold or Metaculus or other prediction site to kind of like record what you believe, will make it so that you have a much better chance of like actually knowing whether or not your prediction came true, and like knowing over time whether you're like getting more and more correct on predicting. And beyond just writing it down for yourself, it's also really nice to publish it. There's like two really good things about publishing your forecast. It lets other people kind of like trust you more as a person who like stands by like what you're saying in a way that people can actually concretely disagree with. And it also like gives other people the information about what you believe. All right. And this is the calibration, one way to check your work. There's a few actual different ways of checking your work. On a prediction market site like Manifold, you have this system of profits where you're kind of like betting a certain amount of money. And if you're winning money as you bet, then you're probably like more correct than the market, and that's good. If you're losing money over time, you're kind of like finding out that you were not as correctly calibrated or correct in the things that you believed. Another kind of system is the Breyer score, which is more used by sites that do not have like a money component, like Metaculus, for example. I'm not going to get into that, but you can look that up later. And finally, calibration is like one very common way of figuring out like if the percentages that you're giving down on questions is correct. So Scott Alexander, one of my favorite bloggers, does this thing where every year he puts down like 100 different questions and lists the question and also a percentage. So an example might be, will my blog have more than 100,000 readers this year? 70% chance. Then he does this for, again, 100 times. And then at the end of the year, grades them by saying, you can see over there, out of the questions that he put down 70% for, how many did he get right? He got 77% of them right, which indicates he was like a little bit underconfident, but overall pretty good. The goal is to get this graph over here of the percentage assumed to percentage that actually came up to kind of line up. So the question they say, I think this is like 99% likely to happen, you want to get like 99 out of 100 of those forecasts to come up true. And the ones that you say like 50% likely to happen, you want about half those to come up true. All right? And that's forecasting in a nutshell. There's a lot more that goes into kind of picking good questions, but that's how we'll get to the exercise. But first off, I want to do like an interactive exercise where y'all can forecast on your first question on Manifold. So here, QR code again. Scan this. It's going to take you to a particular market. And the market is basically going to be resolved based on what happens during the course of this exercise. All right, giving you all a chance to get onto this market. And how this is going to work is this going to be like a game of never have I ever. I'm going to ask all of you to stand up. Stand up. Stand up. All right, there we go. And then the question is, at the end of these 4 questions, will there be 5 or more people still standing? I'm going to ask you to sit down if you have not done this thing before, and stay standing if you have. All right? And before you can start like checking along the market, it probably has a current probability. I'm really curious to see what it is trading at right now. Question?
So if
You stay standing.
You stay standing.
Yes.
If yes.
If your answer is yes, you stay standing. That's correct.
And then you continue.
For these 4 questions. Yep. And we'll see if there are 5 or more people in this room who answer yes to all of these 4 questions. All right? All right. Question number 1. Have you ever tested positive for COVID? Stay standing if you have. Sit down if you have not. Oh, yeah. Take a second if you'd like to trade. You can keep trading along the course of this exercise. This thing will run for like a couple minutes. Yes. So you can put down a couple of the manifold dollars on yes or no, depending on if you think what is the current probability? Someone tell me. I can't see it. 57%. So. OK, cool. So basically, nobody knows. But the market overall thinks that like there's a 57% chance. If you think the true chance is higher than the 57, you should bet yes. If you think it's lower than 57, you should bet no. And then as you bet, you'll basically be rewarded if you're correct for that. So first question again. Yes.
For putting money in?
For mana, yes. You start with like 1,000 mana, so you can like don't worry too much about it. I recommend betting in maybe like 10 mana increments for now, if you're just like playing around with the interface. Question.
Will you sit down if you answer yes?
Sit down if you answer no. Stay standing if you answer yes. So let's do this 1 round at a time. All right. Have you ever tested positive for COVID? Stay standing if you have. Sit down if you've not. OK. So that question eliminated like, I don't know, like a good like 5, 10 people. Not that many. OK. Cool. Question number 2. Have you ever taken a martial arts or dance class? Sit down if you have not. Stay standing if you have. All right. Feel free to update your bets as you're going along with this. You can see there's like a good, I think like 30 people. And you can see what the last 2 questions are. So update your probabilities. All right. Question number 3. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You said
Yes.
update your bets?
Yes. So after you've bet once, you can continue betting. For example, if you bet yes while it was at like 60%, what is the probability now, actually? I'm really curious. 88. Oh, OK. So given that there are a lot of people standing, it seems like people are fairly confident that there will be 5 people left who can answer yes to all of these. So after you bet, you can continue betting at the current odds. The odds that it's quoting is like 88%, which means that if you think it's higher than 88, you should bet yes. If you think it's low, you should bet no now.
So my previous bet, when I bet at 57%, that's going to count as at 57, right?
Yes, that's correct. It will count at whatever you bet at the time. But this probably also moves over time. All right. Question number 3. Have you visited DC before this trip? Stay standing if you have. Sit down if you have not. Oh, OK. There's still a lot of people standing. All right. Now, final question. Have you read more than 10 pages of a book by Will MacAskill? Stay standing if you have. Sit down if you have not. Ooh. All right. So over here, you can see we have the population of people who have gotten COVID, have danced or taken martial arts, have visited DC, and have read 10 pages of a Will MacAskill book. Let's have a round of applause for our winners, I guess. All right. And I will go and resolve this market later at the end. But thank you. Any questions about how that went? Happy to take questions about Manifold, about like what was going on in this case. Question?
I think one question. I mean, the idea generally is when people put money down, that
Yeah.
they're incentivized to really care.
Yeah.
But if there's no money, actually, I mean, is this as accurate as like a monetary betting market? And have you tested that at all?
That's a great question. So there are real money prediction markets that exist. Some of them are called like Kalshi or Predicted, for example. But they tend to be like very heavily regulated in the United States, where they have some laws around what kinds of things you can put online as a thing that people can put in money into. So Manifold, we chose not to be like a real money site because we want to let people just like sign up and start like experimenting with it really quickly. And we also didn't want to like go through the like regulatory burden of like getting things approved. Your question was, what's the difference between like putting on real money versus fake money? We've like known that like we've seen that like actually a lot of our users care a lot about the balance. The way like when you play a video game or when you like have a Twitter account, you care about your video game like dollars or you care about your Twitter like follows. Just the act of putting like a number on a thing and like keeping it limited, Manifold is like a zero-sum system so that like your wins come at a cost of somebody else's losses. This actually gets people to start like caring and competing on this figure. And also, I mentioned the other thing that like lets people care a bit more about this than just like an arbitrary number on the internet is that you can also withdraw it to the charity of your choice. This is like kind of a thing that lets us get around certain regulations because it's not going back to your pockets; it's going to your favorite charity. But yeah, it is a good thing to worry about. And I do think that like real money markets would be even more accurate than the ones that we have. But we notice that like our markets don't just give like completely arbitrary information. Like think about like over the course of this particular exercise, you're probably getting like kind of interesting, reasonable information about like whether or not this is going to come true because people just kind of care about arbitrary balances that are assigned to them. Thanks for asking. Question?
So even if like the grand majority of people are keen to represent reality, is there possible that like even like a small subset, like say 2 to 10%, just not being very good can throw off the accuracy of the market in general disproportionately?
I think on any particular market, this is a thing that can happen, that people can like invest a bunch of their fake points and like throw the probabilities off. But over time, as these markets resolve, they will be losing their fake points, and the people who are predicting correctly will be gaining more. And like the way the ecosystems evolves, it puts more mana, in this case, or real money, in the case of like a real money prediction market, into the hands of people who are more correct. So markets serve as this mechanism of transferring like resources, decision-making power into the hands of people who are correct over time. All right. I'm going to leave other questions towards the end, but thank you so much for asking. Just jumping into a couple other like reasons to do forecasting, why and how to forecast. One reason I think like forecasting is actually like quite important is that it lets you communicate a little bit more accurately than you would communicating using just regular English. So for example, if somebody asks like, will you come to my birthday party? A common thing to say is like, if you're not sure, it's like, oh, maybe, or like probably, or something like that, or explain your circumstances. But maybe actually, the word maybe encapsulates like a wide range of possibilities. And if you can provide a slightly more accurate estimate, like I think there's like a 30% chance versus I think there's like a 70% chance I'm going to be able to come to this birthday party, it provides a lot more data to the person you're talking to about like what your worldview is. The birthday thing is kind of like a silly example, but I actually think it's actually very useful to do in like social settings in real life to talk about like how likely are you to like do certain things. In work context, you can say like, I think there's like a 60% chance that this project will complete on time. And you can see how communicating your amount of belief in a particular like claim or quote is much more accurate using numbers. Other reasons to like do forecasting is that like you can show people that like you are right or find out that you are wrong. Both of these are like very important to figure out. If, for example, people who put up forecasts year after year and continually like are more right about like their forecasts compared to like people who just don't place their like claims in a way that like people actually can like argue against or like bet against. I put a lot more like epistemic like weight on the people who like put up a forecast. And I think most of the EA community does as well. It's generally considered like a virtuous thing to place your forecast in a way that people can disagree with, and otherwise they can see that you're right in like a year's time. Also, just like you can see like for different kinds of events in your own life, like how likely are they to occur? So this is the example I put up. For Taco Tuesday every week, I like to put up a market on like how many people are going to show up to Taco Tuesday, and it helps with like planning on like is there going to be like a wave of people coming because there's like EAG in town, or are there going to be like a lot of cancellations because there's like a COVID going around? This helps me figure out like should I buy a bunch of taco materials or not? So little examples like this of forecasting in your own life I think are like the best way to get started. I often think a lot of people want to forecast on like big important questions, which is like a very admirable, but it's really important to start on like easier, smaller, simpler things, and Manifold is a really great way to do that. Finally, I think it's a lot of fun. It's kind of like a video game where you're trying to like compete on whether or not you can like figure out how to make your points go up by like providing accurate information about the world. All right. One very simple way of forecasting that's actually you might not even have thought about as forecasting is just like placing a bet between two people. So I'm actually going to invite David onto the stage to kind of help me with an example of this. All right. So David is a fellow employee at Manifold Markets. David, would you like to say hi?
Yeah, hi.
So let's say there's something that we disagree about. I've heard through the grapevine that our other employee, Fede, has ridden an ostrich before.
I think he was lying to you.
You think he was lying to me?
I don't think he's ridden an ostrich.
Okay.
Do you think an ostrich can take his weight? Look at him. He's a hunky guy.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, you know, I kind of believe you. I don't think, like, I'm that confident anymore, because, like, you know, Fede, like, saying ostrich would probably, like, just collapse, you know? But I'm willing to put, like, some odds on this. I think maybe there's, like, a 33% chance, or, like, a 1 to 2 odds that, like, Fede has ridden an ostrich. Is that, like, does that seem reasonable to you? Would you take the other side of that bet?
Yeah, so you're saying I think there's a 66% chance he hasn't ridden an ostrich? Yeah, I think I'm happy to take those odds, yeah.
All right, sounds good. What we can do is go to Manifold and then input this as a challenge bet, where basically I'm going to wager, let's say, 100 mana, and David's going to wager like 200 mana. And what this represents is that like David's belief is much stronger than my belief at like a 2-to-1 ratio. And you can convert this ratio into a percentage. If you added it up, 200 plus 100 is 300. 200 over 300 represents 66% chance of having not ridden an ostrich versus a 33% chance of riding an ostrich. Yeah. And in expectation, if I'm right, I will be making money. And if David's right, he'll be making money, depending on how this resolves. So that's how we could run a challenge bet. All right. One nice thing about betting is that we kind of have this.
Have you ridden an ostrich?
I've ridden an ostrich.
Question?
So in challenge bets, is the only way to set odds have differences in the amount that's bet?
Yes, so that is where the odds come into play, when you have like a differing amount. And actually, we're going to go into an exercise on this, so you can kind of like test it out. Here. So scan this QR code, and you'll be taken to a place where you can input a question that you disagree with and bet against the person next to you on Manifold. How this is going to work is y'all are going to pair up with somebody side by side, and then try to find a question that you don't necessarily agree on, someplace that you might have disagreement. One good example is like, what is true about the person next to me, like Fede? Like, has he ridden an ostrich, or has he visited China before? Or can ask other questions. All right, I'm going to let you all go and scan this and pair up. Okay, that's fine. All right.
Hello, hello. Testing, testing.
All right. Time to bring it back to the rest of the talk. All right. Hello, hello. We're going to move on to the rest of the talk. Thank you all so much for trying that out. If you're having trouble resolving the market, you can click on the title of the challenge bet, and I'll take you to the market version, and then you can like resolve it the way you'd like. Hopefully that gave you kind of a sense of like what it is, how to set up a bet between two people. A lot of the bets I think were like very short term, about like a disagreement in the past, and that's great. That's one good use of a bet. But we can also move on to trying to figure out things about the future. So in that exercise, you're thinking a lot about how to like ask a question. And there's like a bit more around the theory of like how to ask like a really good question for purposes of forecasting. Here I'll go over kind of like 3 of the things I've learned in the process of like running Manifold about like what makes a question really good. And these aren't necessarily like there's a right answer for each of these, but rather like it's an important thing to think about. So one of the most important things when you're like trying to figure out like what question to ask when you're trying to create like a forecast is whether you're going to ask the question in the short term or in the long term. And there's like a pretty like sharp trade-off here. Because like a long-term question is usually the thing that you're most interested in. Like, what's going to happen in 20 years? Will like global warming like raise the sea level by like 20 feet? Will like AGI end the world in 2040? These are questions that are like probably the most important use case for like forecasting. But the flip side of it is that like you might think you're going to have to wait a really long time before you know whether or not like your thing came true or false. And if you're starting out with forecasting, like I am and maybe a lot of you are, you don't get as much feedback about whether or not you're right when you ask a really long-term question. So I actually think if you're starting off, you should try to ask questions that are very short-term, that will resolve in a matter of like days or weeks or maybe like a month or so, such that you can kind of get the feedback about whether you are right when you ask and forecast. So instead of asking about like a really long-term question, try like a shorter variant of it if you can. This will help you like get better at the active forecasting, just kind of like building the muscle of asking questions and seeing them resolve. Another axis is like, what kinds of questions do you ask? You can ask very like broad questions that like lots of people might be interested in, or you can ask like very personal questions that only you are interested in. I think in the past, most kinds of forecasting platforms tended to focus on like really big questions like who will win the presidential election, or how many cases of COVID will there be? And those are, again, really important, really big, and they will draw a lot of attention. But the flip side is they're like somewhat less actionable. I think a lot of times they're like really interesting questions to think about, but they don't lead you to make better decisions. So another thing about forecasting is like, I think the goal of forecasting is often to get to a place where you can like do something differently as a result of the forecast. For example, on Taco Tuesday, it's like a question that nobody else really cares about. I care a lot about, but it helps me with like knowing the answer to that changes my behavior. So personal questions are a lot better for that, and Manifold is a really great place to ask because unlike most other forecasting sites, we don't like restrict questions down to broad appeal questions. Anyone can just ask anything that they like. Finally, one axis to think about is like how specific your criteria are. So again, there's this trade-off of like a fuzzy question kind of like pokes at what you really care about. A fuzzy question might just be like, oh, will this thing go well? Will Manifold succeed is like a question I care a lot about, but that's very fuzzy. And then I can try to operationalize that by turning it more specifically into a thing that we can measure. Like, will Manifold succeed according to revenue or according to like daily active users? And will it hit specifically like more than 500 daily active users? Things like that. Getting more and more specific on your predictions lets people actually bet on it. If you're asking just like, oh, will Manifold succeed? It's really hard to figure out how to resolve that. When people come on and try to think about how to bet on it, they don't really know what you have in mind. But it lets you ask questions that are like plausibly closer to what your like true goal is. So there's always these like dichotomies to think about when you're trying to figure out how to phrase a question. All right. And I'm going to kind of skip over this. This is like very Manifold specific. And get to the third exercise, because I think this is like the most fun one. So now you're going to use Manifold to create a prediction market. This is kind of similar to a challenge bet, except instead of just posting this between two people, you're going to ask a question that will be posted kind of to the rest of the people here in this like EAG DC. So if you scan this, it'll take you to a place where you can ask a question and post it. And everyone else in the room will be able to like see the question and perhaps bet on it. I guess instead of 3 to 4 people, you can just use like the tables that you're at. And your goal is like, as a table, like kind of draft a question that you think the other people here at this conference might be interested in. One example of like a subject that people cared about like a while back was like, Omicron will blow through the US before March, leading to herd immunity. So that's like kind of like very a fuzzy like thesis that they had. And then specifically, this was with Zvi Moshewitz and Holden Karnofsky. They operationalized this into a specific like question by like putting down numbers, trying to think through what do they mean specifically between January and March of 2022. Most of the cases will happen, and that's how they turned it into a thing that people could actually disagree on and actually bet on. So your mission here is to do the same thing for some cause area, some question that you're interested in asking about the future. So once again, scan this, and then talk at your tables, trying to figure out like one thing that you're interested in and how you can turn that into a prediction market. All right. Thank you so much for participating along. I was hoping to be able to like screencast like all the questions, but since we can't do that, I'm going to just ask y'all instead, maybe popcorn style. Anyone want to tell us one of the questions they created? It sounds like this group. Ingo, what question did your group ask?
Well, we went on petfinder.com and randomly picked a dog, and then we asked if she'd be adopted within the month.
Oh. That's a good question.
Adorable dog.
Very cute. I bet yes. I don't know about you guys.
It's a market that you can move yourself. If any of you want to find this dog and go adopt it, and then bet yes, make Dorothy.
Will Dorothy be adopted by October 31st?
Yes. Y'all can find the question that everyone else posted by going to the EAG DC 2022 group. You should be able to find it by like clicking on the group in the market, and you kind of see like what else people have been asking. Anybody else want to volunteer one of their questions back there?
Predicted that there would be over 2,600 attendees at EAG Virtual.
Cool. Do you know how you're going to get the final answer? Like, will they publish the total number of attendees in the end?
No, I
All right. That is an important thing when you're thinking about like asking a question, like how do you in the end resolve it? But maybe you can just like ask the organizers to tell you like how many people came.
Rough wording for our question was.
I have an exact wording.
Exact wording for our question.
Nice.
Will the rating for the food from the feedback survey of EAG DC 2022 conference be rated higher than the food at EAG San Francisco 2022?
Very relevant, very important. I like that. Are the ratings published? Can we see what the? I guess you're gonna have to ask the organizers as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure they're happy to share that information with you. My current sense is that like the SF food is better, but we'll see. Anybody else want to volunteer their question? All right. Well, I'm just gonna get into like a couple final notes about forecasting. Specifically, I kind of think people come into forecasting with this mindset of like, oh, this is super cool. This is gonna like solve a lot of problems. And I say like, I do want people to try out forecasting, but I want people to kind of like know what like the trade-offs are. And it's often the case that forecasting isn't like quite as powerful as you might like hope it to be, or like you might actually be able to like not actually get to like questions that are very useful. Over the course of this workshop, you might have like seen some of the like sharp edges, some of the harder things about forecasting, like getting to a question that you actually agree on, getting to like a data source that you can like rely on for resolving the question, getting to like the answer about your question in a timely manner, like short-term versus long-term. So there's a lot of reasons that like forecasting still like isn't quite as widely used. And I think people sometimes think like, oh, forecasting might solve everything, and they try it and they get like a little bit disappointed. So I want to warn you against that. And mostly I kind of wanted to get to like, forecasting shouldn't be treated like an exercise, like, oh, it's a thing that I'm obligated to do that is like really important and I like will like try really hard at, and maybe it's gonna give me some benefits. I would encourage you to treat forecasting instead like as like a toy or a game or a thing you like play with a little bit. That's why I encourage people to like ask personal questions, questions about like their own life, questions about like their friends, things like that, and kind of treat it as like a bit of a game, a bit of a thing that you're like exploring. I think over the course of like asking like lots of small questions instead of like a few really big, important, hairy questions that you're like worried about, lots of small questions will kind of teach you a bit more about like how to think more sharply, how to turn your disagreements into like numbers, into things that you can like concretely like bet on. And overall, I think that will get you like much better along the way of getting to like really understanding what the future will hold, compared to just like treating it as like this really important thing. So that's the biggest takeaway. Hopefully today using Manifold, you got a sense of like how easy it is to kind of create a question on like any subject that you're interested in, and how to like send it to your friends, how to bet on it, how to create these markets. All right. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any like questions you might have had. Question.
I was just wondering, can you hear me? Yeah. I was just wondering what happens when you get to zero money on this market, and is there any way to? Yeah, I was just wondering. Oh, yeah, what happens when you get to zero money, and if there's any way to like build back some wealth?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you can buy back in, and that's Manifold's revenue model. So for every dollar that you put back in, you can get 100 Manifold dollars to continue to bet with. And again, you can't withdraw that to yourself, but you can send it to the charity of your choice. So if you're going to donate, let's say, $100 to charity anyways, instead, why don't you send it to Manifold and then bet, and then see if you can win more money for charity, and then send it to that charity. So that's another way you can continue to participate. You can also get more mana by referring people to the site. You get like a nice bonus for that. We have a few other bonuses that you can get for like posting good comments. People can tip you on those, for example. So Manifold has this kind of ecosystem of like letting you collect more mana in case you run out. Or you can talk to me. I'm generally happy to send people mana if they've run out from my own bank account. Great question. Question?
Yes. So these for forecasting examples that you've provided are sort of single ones. And so what if you are trying to make like a strategic plan, and you're trying to think multiple years in the future, and there's sort of multiple choices that might have multiple impacts, and like they have, you forecast this, and then if that happens, that leads to another scenario where you have to forecast that. Is that sort of something within the, like Manifold platform of sort of essentially integrated forecasting that becomes into a single forecast?
It's not as integrated as I would like. That's a great question. But we do support conditional markets. What this means is that you can ask a question like, if this thing comes true, will this other thing happen? Like, if Manifold releases the betting streaks feature, will we have more than 100 daily active users by the end of this month? That kind of question. So with like a conditional question, how it works is that like you only resolve the market to yes or no if the if statement happens, and you resolve it to NA, returning your money back to all the bettors if it hasn't happened. And in this way, you can kind of build up more complex kind of trees of like possibilities. Like I'm going to forecast what's going to happen in the world where we release betting streaks and what's going to happen in the world where we don't release betting streaks. And this is pointing at a concept called futarchy, where people kind of make decisions via the outputs of prediction markets by kind of like saying like, OK, posit these two worlds. Let people predict what's going to happen if we do A, if we do B, and then in the end, use that to decide which of these worlds we should move into, which feature should we work on. So that's one thing that we can do. We don't have great support for this, but it is possible at the moment. And it's one thing I'm personally very interested in, building out better systems for this kind of thing. Maybe one last question, and happy to take questions after the talk as well.
It seems that. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Yeah. So if markets are all resolved by the creators of the markets, have you had issues, or are there issues with like people asking ambiguous questions and then resolving them in sus ways, or perhaps just resolving in the incorrect, like betting, if people can bet on their own markets, just betting in a direction and then resolving incorrectly? Is this an issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the distinguishing features of Manifold, where the person who asks the question is also the same person who decides what the resolution should be. And this is like very non-intuitive. Most other platforms make it such that like there's a panel of people, maybe the moderators of the site in like Metaculus's case, or the platform people who like own Cauchy, for example, decide how the Cauchy question resolves. Or they tie it to like a very concrete like data source that everyone can like verify for themselves how this thing happens. Manifold doesn't do this. Manifold just lets whoever asks the question, they just let them choose what the resolution should be. And I think a lot of people like worry in the beginning that, yeah, oh, like if people can choose whatever they want, aren't they just going to choose like arbitrarily? Maybe they'll like kind of steal my mana, steal my winnings from me by like resolving it incorrectly. I think in practice, it hasn't happened that much. I would say like maybe between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000 markets feel like badly resolved to me. Sometimes like it's a misclick. Like I've actually like resolved the market incorrectly once because I clicked on the wrong one and hit resolve, and that was my bad. But it's a thing that can happen. I think people can price that into their markets when they're betting. People who have built up a track record of resolving like large markets correctly over time, you kind of get a reputation on Manifold, because you can go look at the person who created it and see like, oh, how long have they been around? How many kind of like questions have they resolved correctly? And over time, people who like are more trustworthy get larger and larger people, more and more people to bet on those markets. So we would like to build in some kind of tools around like getting people like maybe like a star rating on like how trustworthy this creator is, but we don't have that yet. And so far, we haven't needed it that much, surprisingly. Thanks for asking. All right, I think we're out of time. So I'm just going to leave us on this final slide. Thank you so much for coming to this workshop. We're also hosting a session on Sunday office hours. So come to that if you'd like to chat with the rest of the team in person. We're also just going to be like hanging around, happy to answer questions, talk more about forecasting. But once again, thanks for coming.